also happening now because they want that information up front. In February, sometimes stretching into March, they open up these constituent request forms for appropriations. So that gives their constituents a chance to tell them what they would like to see funded. And if enough of their constituents all say the same thing, it's very likely that congressperson is going to try and get that, whatever it is, entered into the appropriations bill. And if that's a very influential congressperson, then it's easier for them to get it into the bill. If they're not very influential, then they're probably going to need multiple Congress people all grouping together, having heard from their constituents about the same thing. So what we're doing now is like grassroots advocacy, trying to get AAS members to fill out these constituent requests, because the more people who fill them out, the more likely it is that our input will actually end up meaning something. So those 12 subcommittees all come up with their own little budgets for their own piece of the pie. The House will do it first, and then the Senate takes their turn doing it. The Senate numbers don't necessarily match the House numbers. So maybe the House gives NASA a 5% increase and the Senate gives them a 10% increase. Well, because the numbers don't match, they have to agree on what the final bill should look like. So that's the conference portion. And this is usually where government shutdowns happen, because Congress can't come to an agreement, or Congress agrees, but the president refuses to sign it into law. So this is where a lot of negotiating happens. If you look at House number versus Senate number versus conference number, the conference number isn't just like the average of the House and Senate number, or it isn't, oh, the House always gets what they want, or oh, the Senate always gets what they want. It's just kind of all over the place. Negotiating this type of thing is actually an exercise for like new people to science policy to go through to see how frustrating and convoluted it is. So it's important, though, that we go through this whole process, because federal funding makes up a huge piece of the basic research pie in the US. So this is a graphic showing US R&D funding. The total R&D is mostly funded by industry, but federal is still a major contributor. If you look at basic research, it's almost half federal. So if that goes away, we're in big trouble. And if you're in the space sciences, chances are very high that the research you're doing is basic research. So it's very important that we advocate and work to make sure that that basic research is getting funded. In general, science and astronomy have bipartisan support in Congress, but there's just so many competing priorities that if we're not getting funded, it's probably because something ranked higher. So it's actually really important to reach out to your members of Congress and tell them that this is something important, worth funding, because especially like right now with COVID happening, Congress basically left all the budgets for fiscal year 2021 flat, because they knew they were going to have to spend a lot of money on COVID, and flat budgets aren't good because they don't keep up with inflation. So we need the budgets to keep slowly and steadily increasing. So it's important to keep reminding our members of Congress about that. So I'm going to go into how do you complete a constituent appropriation request. But before I do that, that was kind of a lot of introductory information. So does anyone want to take this opportunity to ask a question about kind of the intro stuff? Okay. I can't see, so just go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question.
I have a quick question. What was the difference between basic and applied research in those breakdowns?
Right. So basic research doesn't necessarily have an application in mind when you're doing it. So an example of applied research is like studying adhesives for medical bandaging or something like that. And a example of basic research is like studying frog slime. And it turns out that frog slime ends up being a great adhesive for medical bandages. Like weird stuff happens like that. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the largest scientific society, they actually have an awards ceremony every year for really weird sounding basic research that ended up having amazing applications and like saving people's lives. But when it was first being done, it just seemed like this super random basic research with no purpose in mind.
I see. Thank you.
And like general exploration of the universe is considered basic research. Like if you're building rockets and looking into ways to optimize that, that might be considered applied research. But just generally like observing the universe and coming up with theories about how it works, that's considered basic research. Okay. So I've kind of already covered this, but I'll just reiterate. So there's a period each year where your members of Congress allow feed input from their constituents, and you formally submit this input about the appropriations process. So usually you're requesting money, but you can also request language for legislation. And you do this by formally submitting a form, which is now online. Thank goodness. You don't have to worry about mailing this in, or you don't have to do phone calls, although we will end up doing phone calls eventually. So the constituent requests are really important because lobbyists and professional advocates can also be making requests, but we're not their constituents. Like we don't determine if they get reelected or not. So, and also making constituent requests, like if you're a lobbyist living in DC or professional advocate living in DC like myself, you're not anyone with voting powers constituent. So you can't make these requests. So it's really important for societies like the AAS to organize and mobilize our members to be submitting these constituent requests so that members of Congress know, hey, this stuff actually impacts people who live in my state or district. So each office for each member of Congress has their own deadline for collecting this input. Generally, those deadlines fall in late February. High-ranking members, as I mentioned this earlier, get the most weight. So if your member of Congress is very influential, then you submitting this input has an even higher chance of making a difference because you just have to convince your member. If you have a lower-ranking member, then a lot of them are going to need to get informed on this issue and agree that it's important in order for it to make it into having an impact on appropriations. So how to make the request. And this is the beginning of the section that I'm also going to copy into a Word doc because it's just very information dense and it's
Kelsey?
good. Oh, yes?
No.
Oh, it's very, it's good to do like word searches because when you're filling in the form, it'll be like, I'll show you, it'll be in bold. So at the top of the form, to find the form, sorry, getting ahead of myself. To find the form, it should be very easy. All you should have to do is Google representative or senator, their name, and appropriations request form. And one of the top results should be a link to their official website, which will be like theirname.senate.gov or something like that. So check the URL and make sure it's leading to a congressperson's official website. And you're going to end up filling out 3 forms, 1 for your representative and 2 for each of your senators. So you're going to have 3 different office forms to Google. And because each office has its own form, unfortunately, there is no like easy way to do this. So this has been part of the reason that like mobilizing AAS members on this front is difficult, because it's not like other advocacy issues where we can send you an email with a link to click and it has one form that's already mostly filled in and you just click submit. This is all unique. So unfortunately, you do have to do the legwork of finding the forms yourselves. If you have trouble finding a form, definitely ask me for help. Just message me on the Slack or send me an email and I'll help you with it. The forms are going to ask you first for your identifying information to make sure that you are their constituent. When we get to actual congressional visits, being their constituent doesn't matter as much. Say you vote in one district, but you work in even a different state, or you used to work in a different state, it's okay to go visiting those people and talking to them about your experiences in their state or district. But if you're doing a constituent form, it's more specific, like you really only want to fill it out if you're actually their constituent. So further down the form, there's going to be a bunch of boxes for you to fill in, usually with drop-down menus, sometimes just like text boxes, to help them to help the office sort through all the constituent requests that they're getting. So the following slides, I'm going to have in bold some of the keywords that'll probably show up on the form that you might not know what to put in the box for that keyword, and I'll have a suggestion about how you respond to that entry. If you run into a box that doesn't match anything on the list I'm giving you, which will also be in Word doc form, so it's easier to search, send me a message and I can help you. And also just overall, when you fill out these forms, you don't have to be specific. Like, I'm going to tell you examples of things that you can ask for. You don't have to ask for any of these things. You can just say you want support for science funding in general or for just your research. And that also goes for congressional visits. Let's see if this is a question. Oh, yes. Okay, I could not hear you. What are the essential things we're advocating for? Yes. I'm going to give you a list of kind of the core asks, but again, you don't have to use any of those. And especially when we get to the practice session and the mechanics of a meeting, it's more important for you to just show up as a scientist in their state or district, just showing that, yes, this like funding these things or allowing them to happen, voting for them to happen, has an impact on the people that you're responsible for. Like even just showing up and telling your story is enough of a contribution. It's actually better to talk about how the funding or the project has impacted, or the legislation has impacted you specifically, than to just talk about generalizations. Or if you can specify it to, like, say you work for like a big state university or something, to say how it impacts that state university, because that's a big institution in their district or state, so it's going to be important to them. I'm just going to read this other. Yeah. Okay, so if you have multiple addresses that you could be contacting senators or representatives from, I say for the constituent requests, it's based on where you can vote. But for the congressional visits, I would encourage you to visit with as many representatives and senators as you think you can reasonably like say something relevant to. I did congressional visits for the first time as a grad student. I came in person because COVID-19 was not happening then, but just something about like interacting with the office, and not in like a call-in, leave a voicemail type thing, but like having a face-to-face conversation with someone in a congressional office is just kind of a paradigm shifting experience. So the more you can do that, the better. And the hope with Congressional Visits Day is that this won't be your only time doing this, that we are equipping you with the skills to keep visiting and contacting your representatives and senators wherever you live in the future. My fellowship, for those who don't know, the John Bacall Fellowship, is named after John Bacall, who worked at Princeton and used to take the train down to DC quite frequently and made a point of regularly meeting with policymakers all over Capitol Hill and just like showing up at offices and starting relationships with people, talking about how important science and astronomy are. And that was actually hugely impactful because he just kept showing up, and that was all that made all the difference. So our hope
Kelsey?
is, yes.
So is there a way, so assuming we get back to normal at some time and get out of this pandemic, is it possible to go and visit people that way, kind of unannounced anymore? Because now that you have to go through the visitor center and all that stuff, it seems like it's a more cumbersome process.
So if you want to visit inside the Capitol building, you have needed a reason to be there, an appointment, for the last couple years. Actually, I'm sure that's about to get even more strict. But the Capitol building is actually not where most of these visits happen. Surrounding the Capitol building are 6 congressional office buildings, 3 for the House and 3 for the Senate. And that's where most of these meetings and most of like the briefings, which are like when I go to the Hill and I give a presentation for staffers in like a public setting, all of that activity actually happens in the surrounding buildings, which you can wander in anytime you want, as long as you walk through the metal detector. That's all that's required. So I recommend informing them ahead of time that you're coming, because you don't want to show up and have all the people that you would be interested in talking to be in meetings, which is very likely. Even I wouldn't just walk in without an appointment. I always try to let people know I'm coming ahead of time so they can set aside 15 minutes or 5 minutes to talk to me. But technically, you can do that in the office buildings, not in the Capitol building. Now, the logistics of travel and funding for that. So the big pro of Congressional Visits Day is that the AAS would cover the cost of traveling to DC. Because we've opened it up to 50 people, we're not going to cover travel for 50 people, because we had been considering letting the group of you participating in the spring try to do in-person visits in the fall, so you at least got the in-person experience, because it really is, like I said before, paradigm shifting to like physically come to Capitol Hill. I would recommend that you, if you really want to do an in-person visit, like for real in person, and you don't have the money to do it and you need the funding assistance, there are other scientific societies that offer Congressional Visits Days that you can apply through. And then you could also reapply to the AAS one and say that you originally did it during COVID, because we always have a comment section at the end of the application. Say that you did it during COVID, you didn't get the face-to-face experience. And we know as the AAS policy employees that that is a pretty big loss, and we would consider letting you do this again in person. Advocating is an overarching field that is bipartisan, active, for states or districts of. Okay. Yes. So if there are, say, 5 people from California, you can do your visits together, but you should fill out the constituent request forms separately. You can collaborate on what you're writing down. That might be helpful to talk to other people. But you should each be filling out each of the forms, because the more constituents that submit the form and request the same thing, the more likely it is that the representative or senator will register it. Okay, I'm gonna start running through some of the things you might see on the form. So for the organization, you need to record for this your place of employment and AAS, which you'll spell out, American Astronomical Society. If you don't want to put down the organization info for your place of work, then you can put down the AAS info for that. But you should report what they're asking when they say organization is usually they're asking who is your employer. But because you're doing this with us, with the AAS, you should record the AAS, but also mention your employer. You are the point of contact, you personally. So you are going to need to provide your information. And if you work for a university, I recommend, or college, I recommend you contact the Gov Affairs office and let them know that you're participating in Congressional Visits Day and submitting a constituent request form. So there's funding budget requests, which have to do with money, and then there's bill language requests. So say you wanted to add something to the appropriations bill, you wanted to make sure that they specifically had text in there about Europa Clipper, for example. Or you wanted them to specifically not talk about a program, because sometimes that's also good for a program if it is able to fly under the radar and not get called out. So actually NASA versus NSF is a good comparison for this, because NASA, a lot of their line items get dictated by Congress, which means all the things that didn't get specifically called out, NASA has to figure out what to do with the money that's left over. So Congress says, here's NASA's total pot of money, but within that pot of money, they have to spend X amount on this, X amount on this, X amount on this. And NASA says, well, we do a bunch of other stuff, and now there's not a lot of money left for all that other stuff. So we have to figure out how we're going to fund that. So in that case, Congress talking about every line item isn't necessarily a good thing. The NSF is the opposite. Congress pretty much just gives it its pot of money and doesn't touch anything, because they mostly do grants for researchers. So there is no way for Congress to control competed grants. Okay. If you want to talk about money, you need to submit a request that's just about the money. If you want to talk about bill language too, you would submit another request about the bill language. So if you have multiple asks, it's best to submit separate forms for them, because these offices are getting thousands of these forms. And so they're doing everything they can to compartmentalize all the information that they're getting. So you separating it out, especially if you save autocomplete information to your browser, will help the office and increase the chance that they see the request that you're making. Title/name of your request. This is 1 sentence max description of what you're asking for. It's not as formal as it seems. have to move this little bar. Okay. It'll ask about what appropriations subcommittee are you inquiring about, submitting a request for. So if you're submitting a request for NASA, NSF, or NIST, you want the Commerce, Justice, Science subcommittee. If you're interested in DOE Office of Science, then you want the Energy and Water subcommittee. The account is the name of the line item. So an example, like a line item in a budget. So an example of this would be NASA Science Mission Directorate, Planetary Science, Research and Analysis. So like as specific as it gets. This, you only need to fill in, if there is an option for an account or line item, you only need to fill that in if you're talking about money. That doesn't have anything to do with sentences. They might ask for the PBR, which is the presidential budget request, or the fiscal year 2021, so the previous year, because now we're looking at fiscal year 2022. That's what we're advocating for, is the next year. So they might ask for what are the current numbers. So if that's the case, I actually have tables with those numbers, and they're in this link. I know that the table in the most recent one, which is the final appropriations, definitely has the fiscal year 21 numbers. I'll actually look up also and also link the post that's just about the president's budget request to make sure you have both sets and all the numbers. So you can just refer to the tables if you need to look up any numbers. Okay, there might be something about direct or mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. This is not mandatory spending. That's stuff like Social Security. This is discretionary spending, which is non-defense, not Social Security, pretty much everything else. So pretty much all of science funding that's not defense falls under discretionary spending. The project number or designated offset, if you see a box for that, just leave that blank, skip that. If they ask for the federal agency or office, you would enter something like NASA, NSF, DOE. It depends on which one you're talking about, but that's the name of the agency. If you see a box that's asking for program element, that has to do with defense only, so you can skip that. And then at some point, there's going to be like a larger text box that's asking you to describe how your request benefits the state or district. So this is your spot to basically do like a short version of your spiel for the visit. So talk about why it matters to you as their constituent and your employer, especially if you work for like a large research center or institution in that state or district. If there's a box asking if the office has been briefed on the issues, you can say that you will be briefing them when you visit in the future. So the general message, this is where I'm going to get into the list of things that you can ask for when you're filling out these forms. The general, most basic root of the message is strong, sustained support of basic research driven by scientific community consensus prioritization. So strong, sustained means slow and steady increases. So not cutting the budget, not leaving it flat, not giving us more money than we know what to do with, which will lead to them cutting the budget back the following year. Slow and steady increases are best. The focus is on basic research. And this scientific community consensus prioritization. So the highest level of this is the decadal survey. So the decadal survey acts like the golden seal of approval for anything. So for those of you who don't know, the decadal survey is run by the national academies, which is not part of the federal government. So the federal government pays the academies to be an objective third party to study things for them. And a decadal survey is when a scientific field brings together a large group of some of the highest ranking members of the community to determine what the priorities of the field should be for the next 10 years, hence decadal. So currently the Astronomy and Astrophysics Decadal Survey is finalizing their report, which it has been delayed by COVID. So now we're expecting it hopefully early June at the absolute latest. It's not going to be ready in time for this visit, but it's always important to reinforce the message, like, listen to the decadal. There's a decadal survey coming out, whatever it says, that's the community consensus. Like, we can't get together a larger, broader group of the community than this one to talk about something. There's also a planetary science and astrobiology decadal survey currently happening. Heliophysics just had their mid-decadal, which is kind of like a progress report. It doesn't change anything about the decadal survey. It's just a 5-year check-in. So they're still a few years off from their next decadal survey. Okay, so here's a list of things that maybe you want the member to do. And depending on how much you know about science policy, you might pick something other than the example in bold, which is basically just requesting stuff for appropriations, because that's the bread and butter. If you know a thing or two about Congress, you might ask your member to join a caucus. Or there are these things called sign-on letters, which are like dear colleague letters that members of Congress draft and ask other members to sign on to. So as a professional advocate, I might hear about one of those. If I do, I will forward you all the information on that sign-on letter, but there aren't any right now. Supporting a nominee. So the next NASA administrator, for instance, when they go through their nomination hearing, just asking a member of Congress if they sit on the right committee to let that happen swiftly and smoothly. Offering an amendment to legislation. So if you if you are funded by the NSF and there is something you want to see changed about NSF is up for something called reauthorization this year. That means so basically Congress authorizes the agencies to exist and function. And they routinely do this once every couple years, and they have to keep doing it because the things that the agencies are working on change. So NASA and NSF keep getting reauthorized, and this year there's supposed to be another reauthorization. So if there's anything we want to change about the way the agency functions, it's supposed to go in that authorization. Co-sponsoring legislation, I will mention a specific bill in a couple of slides that you could ask your member of Congress to co-sponsor, and that basically means they sign on as saying, I definitely support this and I think other people should support it. And then holding hearings. So I mentioned that when I was talking about the budget cycle, that's when Congress calls in a panel of experts to talk about a topic. Right now, all the hearings have been about COVID. It's the topics of highest importance. So currently, like, pretty much all of ground-based astronomy is threatened by satellite constellations, and that's still like on the lower rung of things that could garner a hearing. So it's unlikely that you have something to ask for that would be worth a hearing, but if you think you have an idea, you can run it by me. Okay, so if you think you would feel comfortable asking about money, for NASA Science Mission Directorate, the minimum is actually $7.7 billion. My boss, the policy director, was just on a phone call earlier this morning that says we might actually go with a higher number, more like 8 billion. So I would say if you are someone who would fill out your request form to talk about money for NASA, hold off, and I will try to have an update next week. I'm hoping we will have a meeting with basically the coalition of organizations that are invested in NASA science. We have monthly meetings, and so we all try to agree on an ask for NASA science. So we should be having a meeting this month, next week. And then I'll have an update on what that number should be, because my boss thinks it's probably going to be higher than 7.7 billion. But the plus 5% increase, that's like a normal standard ask. Now you're going to notice that the next two have significantly higher than 5% increases. I'm actually going to talk about DOE Office of Science first. That one has a 10% increase. The reason it's double 5% is because a lot of the science agencies got held flat. They weren't given any increases for fiscal year 2021. So we're trying to make up for that by giving them both of the increases, the one we would normally ask for plus the one that they missed. So that one is confirmed with other groups that are interested in the Office of Science at DOE. That one is going to be 7.7 billion. And then NSF, I'm just going to check the chat. Sorry. DOD as well. Okay. If you're interested in DOD numbers, message me directly, because we normally don't deal with that. So I'm going to need to ask the policy director, the AAS policy director, Joel Perriott, about what to do for that. The NSF has historically been underfunded, and they are the science agency. Like, they're the one agency that has their fingers in every science. So we would really like to see a dramatic increase in the funding for the NSF, because that improves research funding for all fields. So we're asking for a pretty big increase to get it up to $10 billion. That's an 18% increase. But there are multiple pieces of legislation that were submitted last Congress and will likely be reintroduced this Congress. One of them was submitted by Chuck Schumer, so that's almost definitely getting reintroduced, that are asking for dramatic increases of the NSF budget. So we have a chance to make this happen. And so when we did our first virtual visit, last year's visit was delayed due to COVID, and we ended up doing a virtual visit in the fall. And the only thing it was appropriate to talk about at that point was COVID. It was really going to come off the wrong way to even try and talk about appropriations at that point. It was just too late in the season. All anyone could think about was COVID relief. Right now, we're in a different time, but COVID is still pressing on everyone's minds. So there is a specific piece of legislation that could help researchers as part of a relief package, and that is the RISE Act. It was actually introduced last Congress and is being reintroduced this Congress. It would provide billions of dollars in relief for the federal science agencies. So this could be used. Right now, we've been kind of stuck on the no cost extension train, which was desperately needed, and it's a good thing that the science agencies were authorized to do that. But the AAS has done some surveys of the membership and impacts from COVID, and we're getting a lot of responses saying the money is running out. Like, a no cost extension is not enough at this point. So we really need a cash infusion for researchers. Now, there are other things you could talk about that aren't those two things. How are you funded specifically? What project are you working on? What research related issues do you care about? Are also, it's basically up to you to make it personal or just stick to the more generic options I've offered you. Whatever you feel comfortable doing. And also there will be other possibly smaller items that you could write about, like the sign-on letters, which again, if I hear about any of them, I will circulate those, because members of Congress and their staff are always interested in what the most recent sign-on letters in circulation are. So that is something valuable to submit to them if you don't like anything else. And talking about these things, all of these things I've mentioned, the dollar amounts, the COVID relief, more personal stuff to you, these aren't just things you can talk about in the constituent requests. They're also things you might